So Marvel's all woke, all lame version of the Punisher is coming out. The revamp changes the Punisher symbol, gives him ninja swords, and has him join the Hand, the villainous clan of ninja. The idea itself isn't half bad, but the reason behind it is completely retarded. Some people at Marvel don't like that the right, especially cops and military, use the Punisher symbol and idolize him. So, Marvel's going to ruin the character to try to own the right. It's another one of Marvel's bad decisions done out of spite and pettiness. For some reason, some of the people running Marvel think that the only people who read comics are left-leaning, or at least should be. They seem to think that they've done something wrong if conservatives like their characters and stories. It's almost like they don't understand how stories work. Everything you write isn't going to appeal to your intended audience. Sometimes people you don't like will like your work. Sometimes they might even identify with the characters, even ones you don't want anyone to like. This is how stories work. Your job as a creator is to pay attention to this, and if you want to address it, you do that in the story, and you do it without being pretentious. This would be the normal way of addressing the right's affection for Frank Castle. Instead, Marvel decided to wreck the character to spite his fans, which got one fan to ask Chuck Dixon, former Punisher writer, this question, quote, "If it's true that Marvel really did change the Punisher symbol because they don't like the kind of people who like it, i.e. police and military, then it begs the question, why do the people at Marvel hate their fans so much? Well, it's not that they hate their fans. It's that they hate a certain type of fan, the conservative. They don't agree with the right's politics, so they don't want the right anywhere near Marvel Comics. This is what ideologues do. They try to keep their spaces pure, which is why conservatives do the same thing to liberals and progressives. The general rule is that you can stay if you keep out of sight and out of mind. Of course, that usually doesn't last long because they genuinely don't like the other side. So even if you're not doing anything, they'll find a reason to target and get rid of you. And as you can see with the comic book industry's stagnant sales, that doesn't make for good storytelling or good business. However, I think there's a better question to be asked. Why do the people who hate the government love the enforcers of the government? Think about it. The right, especially the hardcore religious conservatives, seem to think the United States government is the worst evil ever visited upon man. Everything else pales in comparison. The government can't be trusted. Unless conservatives are in power, then it's perfectly trustworthy. Because it'll abuse its power. It's gonna put its boot on the neck of the people. But the people whose feet are in those boots, they're the bestest people ever. It's one of the most confusing things about the right. You think the government is evil incarnate, but the people who enact and enforce that evil are heroes and saints? There's this weird cognitive dissonance at play, and I don't know if conservatives don't see it or don't care, but it's very much there, and it explains why they get so confused about other people not liking the government's enforcers. If you think the government is corrupt, who do you think will enforce that corruption? Damn right, the cops and the military. You'd think the anti-government conservatives would be fine with the woke progressives' hatred of cops and military, but no. The right is actually bothered by it. As Chuck Dixon explains, quote, "They have contempt for the Punisher, this new crowd of editors. And quite frankly, when I was at Marvel writing the Punisher in the 90s, there were quite a few editors who didn't like the Punisher. They sure liked to have him show up in their books because it would increase sales, but they didn't like him as a character. And Marvel didn't seek those kinds of readers even then. Well, what kind of readers are we talking about? The Punisher is a very specific character with a very specific motivation. He's not a hero. He's not even an anti-hero. He's more of an anti-villain. He's the bad guy who sometimes does the right thing for the wrong reasons. Who would be attracted to that kind of character?" Dixon went on, quote, "They certainly don't seek the kind of readers who would like the Punisher now. In addition to their contempt for the Punisher, I think this current crop of editors has a deep-seated dislike of the police and the military as well. So it's the old gang of deplorables thing. They don't want to deal with them, and they don't like the idea that they use this symbol. And I think they don't quite understand why the police and military adopted the Punisher symbol. Considering who the Punisher is and what he represents, I don't understand it either. The Punisher is basically a functioning sociopath. He's got some control over himself, but he's a murderer and a torturer. He takes the law into his own hands to do what the government, specifically the police who admire him, won't or can't do. He doesn't care about due process, he doesn't care about innocence, he makes the rules, he decides who's guilty, and the punishment for guilt is a very painful death. And he does it without an ounce of regret, whether he gets it right or wrong. So yeah, it's a little weird that the military, who prides itself on honor, and the police, who are the enforcers of the law, would idolize and adopt the symbol of a dishonorable murderous vigilante. But Dixon explains the reason for the strong arm of the government adopting the symbol of an anti-villain. Quote, "First of all, it's one of the coolest symbols in comics. I think it's right behind Batman, and Superman and Spider-Man is one of the coolest symbols. It's iconic. Yeah, I'll give you that. The skull does look pretty cool." Dixon goes on, quote, "And it's also representative of badass." That's it? That's the reason. Okay. Seems a little shallow to me, but continue. Quote, "And let's face it, Frank Castle is the biggest badass in the Marvel Universe. You could say, oh well, Wolverine. Well, Wolverine is practically unkillable, so he can afford to be a badass. Yeah, but there's a major difference between Frank and Logan. Logan doesn't want to be that way. He's in a struggle against his violent nature. Frank isn't. He embraces it, and he sees other people who don't, or who don't have that nature at all, as weak. That's not exactly an admirable quality." Dixon goes on, quote, "The Punisher, not so much. He's a self-made man, much like Batman. Batman, the biggest badass in the DC universe. These are both just average guys with the will to seek justice in their own way. Yeah, except the Punisher does something Batman doesn't and would never do. Batman would never kill. He doesn't torture for the sake of torturing. He's not cruel, he's not malevolent, he's not evil. Batman also does something the Punisher doesn't. He works within the system when he knows the people involved aren't corrupt. He supports the due process. He acknowledges there's such a thing as innocence. He admits his mistakes. The best difference between the Punisher and Batman is that Batman has such a character that even his enemies know that if they were ever in serious trouble, they could come to him for help, and he would help them. And you know this because you helped establish that. Batman wouldn't trust them, but he would help them. The Punisher's enemies would be stupid to ask him for help. He'd probably just kill them. But on the off chance that he didn't, he'd get the info he needed from them first, and if they were no longer useful, then he'd kill them. This is who the cops and the military support." Dixon continues, quote, "And the Punisher is eminently killable. He's in danger every time he leaves the house. Sometimes he's in danger when he's at home because he's made so many enemies. Yeah, that usually happens when you go around murdering people. Some of the people who know them are going to want to return the favor." He continued, quote, "And so I think that's what the police and the military are looking at. That this is a badass symbol for a badass character." Right. Just to make sure I understand this correctly, the cops and the troops support a villain who's the very antithesis of how they view themselves because they see him as a badass. And you're shocked that the people who are concerned about the government abusing its power would be bothered by the government's enforcers idolizing such a character. By wearing the Punisher symbol, cops are basically saying, he's right. They are too soft on crime. The cops should be the ones who decide the law. In fact, they should be the law. They should get to decide who's guilty. They should be able to put a bullet or 2 dozen into anyone they think deserves it. And they think this makes them badasses, being sociopaths and violating every right everyone could ever have. I mean, let's be real for a second. If Frank Castle were a real person, he'd be the guy burning villages and raping women in Vietnam. He'd be the guy shooting the Afghan kid because he looked like a terrorist. He'd be the prison guard beating the shit out of the inmates. He'd be the cop killing the black guy who gave him too much lip. In real life, Frank Castle would be one of the last people you'd ever want to put into a position of power because you'd never be able to control him and because he has few, if any, limits. There's nothing admirable about that. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't explore the character. This kind of thought experiment of what happens if a functioning sociopath took justice into his own hands is exactly what fiction is for. But it is fiction. I'm all for people having the power fantasies, but if the Punisher is your power fantasy, there's something a little more than fucked up about you. Dixon then says, quote, "Some of them may not even be aware that the symbol goes with the comic book character. Well, that just makes it worse. You can kind of excuse the military wearing a skull since it's part of their job to kill, but the cops? You want me to think you're an honorable representative of the law and trust you, and you're wearing a skull? No. I'm going to think that you get to do whatever you want to do because you have a badge, and the skull is a threat to back that up. I mean, you could wear the bat symbol or the S shield, but you chose a skull, which has long been a symbol of intimidation and fear. I wonder why you chose it." Then Dixon gets into the changes Marvel made to the Punisher. Quote, "The woke crowd at Marvel are changing the symbol and changing Punisher's entire modus. He's carrying samurai swords now, because they are embarrassed. They are embarrassed to be associated with people who probably don't share their worldview. And that's really as simple as it gets." Yeah, probably. But I think it's more that they don't have an ounce of creativity in their bodies. You could get more good ideas from the drool coming out of a newborn baby's mouth than many of these people working at Marvel today. This was the best they could do, because they're so obsessed with trying to make the right look bad or stick it to them that they forgot that it's easier to just let the right make themselves look bad. Instead of changing the symbol, Marvel should have tried to change the meaning of the symbol either to something that was positive that conservatives wouldn't like or something negative that conservatives wouldn't like. This would be done over time, not in a couple of issues, so that it would be subtle and less predictable. If they wanted to be dickish about it, they would write stories having the Punisher reflect the worst tendencies of the right, again, with subtlety, so it'd be less predictable. They could have Frank go after people the right doesn't like or wouldn't care about, and let it play out with a kind of Game of Thrones ambiguity. That way, when the conservatives praise the Punisher for doing objectively horrible things, you could just point to them and go, see? Hell, just making him outwardly conservative might be enough to piss them off. After all, these people have the thinnest skin imaginable, and that's saying something considering that the woke skin is damn near translucent. The right skin is so thin it might as well be air. You can see right through it. It takes nothing to set them off. So use that to your advantage. Tell the typical Punisher story, say the Punisher going after traffickers, but then make one of the trafficking victims, I don't know, gay, and have Frank leave them or kill them, and not in the same scene. At some point, Frank would either leave or kill them, and then at a different point, mention that they were gay or did some gay shit, and then everyone will connect the dots on their own. I mean, honestly, y'all have to be the only people in the world who have the easiest time making your enemies look bad by just letting them do what they do, and still manage to fuck that up. Do you realize how incompetent you have to be to fuck up someone else's unforced error? Just epic levels of stupidity, which is why Dixon is completely right when he said, quote, "Is it a bad business model? Of course it is, but generally comic book companies, the big two in particular, are kind of clueless about their own readership. They don't know who's reading them, they don't reach out for new readers, they don't care to find out what their readers want in order to keep them reading. They stopped doing that 20 years ago. It just seems to be, as I said before, for these editors, seems to be a stepping stone for some other kind of career. Yeah, that's a problem. These people don't care about the medium. They don't care about comics, they're not invested in them. This is just a tool for them to get the job they really want, but couldn't get because they either didn't have the right connections or frankly weren't good enough. I think some of that spite comes out in the stories, and that partly explains why these people latched on to the wokeness. If they were right-leaning, it would have been religion, and they'd be the typical sanctimonious douchebags preaching about their so-called better ideas. The woke found the thing that validates them, and they will defend it against their enemies as ineptly as possible, even if that means tearing down their own readership to do it. When the best idea you have to own the right is to give the Punisher a half-assed hazard symbol and ninja swords, I think it's time you just give the fuck up. You have no ideas. Go home, go to bed, and maybe you'll dream some up. But what do I know? I'm just some guy.